All right, welcome back, grade 10s. We are going to talk about this source. Now, I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about sources. So I totally appreciate your hands up, and you're going to get a chance to say some stuff. But this is meant to be, Mrs. Osterwald's class aside, meant to be your first exposure to source interpretation. So those of you that had Mrs. Osterwald for grade 9, you are ahead of the curve. You're ahead of the class. That's great to be, because 40% of our writing will be source interpretation. So I want to make sure we go over how to do this, because in a course that's quartered, our quizzes and tests will be coming soon. We could be doing a test on this by the end of next week, a test on this kind of process. But I want to make sure I teach it. So when you do a source interpretation, the first step, and in case you're feeling like, oh man, overwhelmed a little bit, my social 30 class that I had this morning, they need help with this same assignment. So they're still trying to learn how to do it too. So don't feel like you have to become an expert overnight. But the first step that we often do is simply say, well, what's on the page? What is on the page, right? So if I'm making a list, that's like step one. What's on the page? And the reason why we do a description of the source is as we describe it, we're dissecting it. Because as we try to identify, well, what's there, naturally we begin to think about why is it there? And it's the why part that we're going to mark. But students can't get to the why until they do the what. So the first step here is what's on the page. So if I was doing an A1 paragraph, I might begin by saying, source 1 is a political cartoon, or just a cartoon. Source 1 is a cartoon, and within the cartoon, we can see one dominant figure, and that is meant to represent the USA, and we know that because they're wearing a t-shirt that is labeled the USA. They're sitting on a planet, and underneath the planet, there's a huddled mass of other people. And if we look closely, we can see that they are of a variety of cultural attires. We can see somebody wearing traditionally Mexican clothing, somebody wearing traditional clothes of someone living in the Bedouin. So there's people representing many other areas of the world. And the United States individual sitting at the top, he's drinking something, but it says oil. So he's not drinking water, which we would think he would be drinking. He's drinking oil. And the only thing that is being said is move over a bit. So I might spend a couple of sentences just describing what's on the page. Then what we try to do is connect it to globalization. And as we connect it to globalization, we really connect it to language. And one of the connections to language here is what we're seeing is the process of Americanization. So this cartoon is showing Americanization. It's showing the United States trying to dominate, trying to control the planet. We're seeing in the competition of resources, in this case oil, the United States perhaps over-consuming. That's why they're shown as such an imposing figure. And therefore it's created a disparity, a gap between the haves and have-nots. USA has oil, and the rest have not oil. So we can see some kind of reference of wealth and a disparity of wealth. So this might be, because this shows oil, this might be focusing on economic globalization. And the cartoonist might be suggesting that through economic globalization, the United States have been able to take an unequal share of the world's wealth. So they have an unequal share of the world's wealth, and this might be a criticism of globalization. So the cartoon is meant to criticize globalization. So what's the purpose of the cartoon? The purpose of the cartoon is meant to highlight the unfair activities of the United States, to criticize that, and try to promote some kind of change. A change where the United States has an epiphany, an awakening, that they're over-consuming oil and they need to share it with others. I did. This board is super sensitive. So a solution that the cartoonist might want is for the United States to think more about cooperation. So, in summary, one of the assignments that we're going to be doing a lot is called a source interpretation. And we're going to go through it many times. We're going to go through many steps. But one way to get started is to say, what's on the page? Here, we have a cartoon. Within the cartoon, we have different figures. The dominant figure is the United States. But they've been drawn in a way that the cartoonist is meant to be critical of the United States, but showing the Americans to be selfish. So what kind of characteristics can we provide for this character? They're selfish because the United States is saying, move over a bit. Even though the United States has this, and then I'll get to your points, even though the United States has, by the diagram, the largest ecological footprint, they want more. So they're being critical of the consumptive nature of the United States. Yeah, I saw some hands up. Yes, sir.
So, since a good portion of Americans are obese and they're one of the majority, most of their people are obese and their obesity rates are definitely higher than most countries. Could we assume that the cartoonist is picturing them as like the Godzilla of people and how they're destroying the earth, just how Godzilla or King Kong destroyed New York?
Yes, I think that the image of the United States here is both a micro and a macro criticism of the United States. So it's a micro criticism. It's criticizing Americans on a personal level, a micro level. So they're saying at a micro, at an individual level, the United States overconsumes. But then it's also a macro criticism, a macroeconomic criticism of the United States as a nation. So I think that they have drawn the United States in a familiar way so that we can criticize them both microly, individually, but also macroly. And yes, you could go into the Godzilla destroying the world and that kind of stuff too.
And all the people are on the bottom are also more physically in shape, or thinner. So then that's saying that they consume less and they're also likely healthier.
It might be healthier to consume less. Yeah, you could infer that for sure. Gibson?
Going back on the obesity statement, it could be that, like you said, talking about how America overconsumes a lot. And you briefly mentioned solutions earlier and criticisms of the cartoons, so that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
A solution would be to go on a quote-unquote diet, as in consuming a better amount, a more equal amount.
Okay. Absolutely.
Would definitely have a detriment to the economy, as in a person who was going on a diet, it would have a detriment to them and how they were feeling at first, but then it would also be for the better of everything else. And my main criticism of the cartoon is that it's only America and not anything else, whereas other countries are mass consuming and mass producing, which can also have a massive detriment to the entire world.
Absolutely. So two excellent points there, and I want to reiterate them. One point is that the problem that the cartoonist is presenting is overconsumption by America. So the solution we can infer is that America needs to change their consumption patterns. Specifically though, they're consuming oil. So they're trying to, we can infer that the cartoonist would like to see America not consume oil and not overconsume their fair share of oil. So that's definitely the first part of what you were saying. The second part, so one thing that we can do with A1 is show the problem solutions. The second thing that we can do that you did quite well there is talk about what's the bias or the limitation of the cartoon. So the bias or the limitation of this cartoon is it's ignoring the fact that Canada has a very similar ecological footprint per capita to America. And there are other countries that have similar ecological footprints to America. And yet the cartoon is villainizing America, right? So there's an anti-American bias here. And so and then I'll get to your points. If you're trying to get to an E on this assignment, It's important to describe what's on the page, why it's on the page, but it's also important to say the problem solution and talk about the assumptions and the bias. Those are important steps. Yes, sir.
The people at the bottom, the USA looks pretty comfortable. He's sitting on his butt. Yeah, he just looks happy with himself. But the people at the bottom, they're all huddled together, and that doesn't seem like a very comfortable position. But because they're so small compared to the USA, they can't do anything.
Yep. So there's through the cartoonist is using size to show power, relative power, and I like the idea that you brought forth, the idea that the people in the bottom seem like they're a huddled mass that are quite vulnerable, right? I can see that. Yes.
Seeing as they are all fairly culturally appropriated, I think this might have a little bit more to do with like culture and stuff.
I keep doing this. Yeah.
Sort of the way that the U.S. is obviously going to keep getting fatter
Yeah.
from all the oil that it's
Yeah.
drinking. It's going to take up more and more space until they have to go away. They have to bugger off.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that maybe
You said bugger off. You don't hear that all the time. I think you're onto a very good point here.
taking over the world because no one's brave enough or big enough to stop them from consuming and expanding.
What you're also talking about is the cultural externality of economic expansion. So, because, and you said this in the beginning, that they're very clearly illustrated by culture, right? So, what could be lost here is with the expansion of the United States based upon their consumption, is when they go looking for more oil, they're going to impact other people's culture. And that brings me to a story that I'm going to get you guys to read in a moment. Going back to chapter 1. Man, I'd like to pretend I made this this was purposefully linked like this. But we're going to read about the Lubicon Cree on pages 32 and 33. And we're going to see how the United States' thirst for oil brought them to Alberta and led to a negative effect on the cultures of the Lubicon Cree. So we're going to actually see that in a moment when we get you to read that. Before we read it, yes, sir.
So Jackson, what you said made me think of something that's in my head, because you talked about how once they get to the point where they effectively can't fit, they've got to just leave. And that just comes to my mind with also just the selfish tendencies of a country with that much power.
Yes.
They're consuming so much, but by the time they take so much space they have to leave, in my eyes, or in my head, I imagine everybody else is being left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I word it is that they just kind of leave the earth in the dust in a way, or destroy it.
Yes.
Now, I'm of the belief that it's very likely we could just destroy the earth and then move on to Mars.
Yeah.
That's kind of the idea I get, where it's just they're so selfish that they take this planet at this scale,
And we use it all up.
else, and then they just move on.
Yeah, we move on to the next one.
And then just leave the crap one for everybody else.
Yeah. We're going to watch a documentary called The Corporation that talks about how corporations act as psycho and sociopaths because they go around the world feeding on vulnerable peoples and then move on to the next lot. It's exactly what you're talking about. Okay, I'll give you a final word and then we'll read that thing about the Lubicon Cree.
What the one person said about taking other people's culture when the U.S. goes for looking in other countries for oil,
Mm-hmm.
you can also counteract that by saying if they look for oil in other countries, they could hire people from those countries to get that oil, making their country richer.
Yeah.
They both benefit.
So the United States looking for oil can help Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates become very wealthy. Absolutely. Or Americans that go to Saudi Arabia, we might come back to Canada or America, and we might bring part of the Saudi culture with us.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're going to get you to read the story about the Lubicon Cree, and you should be able to see the cultural externality. Cultural externality, and externality is the unintended consequences. So I want you to look for the cultural externality of America's thirst for oil. And I want you to write something down on your page about how the Lubicon Cree shows us The cultural consequences of economic globalization. And I'll come around and I'll just mark you on the fly. You're not handing it in, I'm just gonna look over the shoulder kind of stuff. So, cultural consequences of economic globalization, looking at the Lubicon Creed. And don't worry, you're gonna get 100% on this.